Hello, and welcome to Mosaic. Our topic today is history, specifically the history of North America, and more specifically, the history of Catholics in North America. Our guest today is an eminent historian, the author of a dozen books. His latest, which we have here with us, is Continental Ambitions, Roman Catholics in North America, the Colonial Experience. Our guest is Kevin Starr, a lifelong Catholic, a San Francisco boy who lives here still, educated at St. Ignatius High School and USF. He has a doctorate from Harvard, many other degrees and awards and honors, and he is currently University Professor of History at the University of Southern California. His new book tells the stories of the first 3 centuries of the European encounter with North America, from about 1500 to 1800. And he opens with this bold statement: there can be no understanding of American culture and history without an understanding of the role played by Catholic peoples in the unfolding drama of the American experience. Who were those peoples, and what were those roles? Please stay with us, and after this break, we will talk with Professor Starr and try at least to scratch the surface of his amazing fund of historical knowledge. Welcome back to Mosaic. Our guest today is Professor Kevin Starr, author of the book Continental Ambitions, Roman Catholics in North America. Now, Kevin Starr, let me ask you this about your title. You say in your introduction that there are many fine histories of Catholics in America that have a regional or national perspective. The perspective you've taken is continental. So it's a larger perspective. Why did you adopt this perspective? Where does it take you?
Well, I adopted this perspective because it was adopted by 2 very strong Catholic civilizations in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, which is to say New Spain and New France, and a very small, to a lesser degree, by the Catholic colony of Maryland. I adopted it also because I wanted to get that mixture of approaching the continent of North America in terms of exploration, settlement, in certain cases conquest, in certain cases rather terrible misbehavior towards the Native Americans. At the same time, that other side, which was submerged and sometimes surfacing in that of evangelization, of coming into this new world, North America, and bringing Catholic peoples there, encountering the indigenous peoples, and then trying to create some kind of Catholic civilization in this magnificent unfolding continent, which of course takes about 300 years fully to explore.
It's striking because from your book I was reminded how huge North America is.
Yes.
We tend to think of the U.S. and Canada, but really from the bottom of Panama to the top of Greenland, and from Newfoundland east to this Bering Strait, that's North America.
That's right. And if you look, say, for instance, if you tilt your globe of the world, the Bering Strait's about 40 miles, and if you on the other side, as the Norse found when they settled Greenland, North America was only on a 6 to 10 day voyage away. Yeah. So the settlement begins as early as that. In the year 1000, roughly 1000, you have the Norse from Iceland establish a colony in Greenland that lasts to the mid-1450s, lasts to the middle of the 15th century.
You state that in your book, and you say, yes, 1,000-year Catholic history in North America, starting with the Norsemen in Greenland and then coming down.
Yes, and the colony in Greenland, the Norse elected to become, the Icelandic Norse elected to become Catholics of their own free will. They voted themselves in as Catholics under the encouragement of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson. And for that period of time that they had the colony in Greenland, they had a bishop who arrived in the 1130s. They had a cathedral, the beautiful cathedral Godar. They had 2 monastic houses. They had a diocesan clergy. In other words, there was a 6 to 10 day voyage from Vinland, which they eventually got over to, and maybe as far south as Chesapeake Bay. There was the North American continent beckoning them. They had sailed off it, and they knew it was there, and it called to them.
Now, let me ask you this. Your book is structured to tell 3 main stories, 3 different Catholic nationalities coming in and doing their enterprise. We have the Spanish, we have the French, and we have the English in North America. So what were the ambitions of these three different groups? Differing ambitions, similar ambitions? Had they compete? Did they ever collaborate?
They began to meet in Louisiana in the 18th century and in the Floridas as well. But in the first phase of it, in the 1520s, it came up from the Caribbean. I open up with a chapter on Las Casas, because the Caribbean is not technically North America, but it's the staging area for New Spain. In the 1520s, they come into Florida. The Cabeza de Vaca, there's a great hurricane, and he and three companions are shipwrecked on the shores of North America and walk all the way from Florida to Mexico City. A long time, multi-year pilgrimage, which transforms each of them in a very powerful way. And then you move up into St. Augustine or St. Augustine. How you pronounce that varies. In 1565, you have the creation of a fully realized European-style, Spanish-style city. Yeah. And then I move it over to New Mexico and the encounter with the Pueblo Indians, the Great Pueblo Revolt, also against the coming of the Christians. I look at the conquest of Acoma. In other words, I'm using this ambition. These ambitions are not always noble ambitions, and sometimes they're ambitions to clear away the Native Americans who get in the way. But as time goes on, there's a deepening of relationship, both to the continent itself, in Spain and France, Spain and French culture, a deepening of relationship to the continent itself and to the indigenous people themselves, and to the possibilities of creating a Catholic place.
The ambition to care for the natives whom they met. And what was striking in all this is that ambition to care for the natives, I think, and to protect them seems to have been carried by the religious orders that came in.
Yes, as early as 1510. Fray Montesinos, a Dominican father, rises up at the cathedral in Hispaniola and in front of the whole establishment, the whole government establishment, in his sermon says, God will go punish us for what we're doing to the Native Americans. We must change our ways, and we must make atonement. That's what led Las Casas to join the Dominicans. He was a planter, an adventurer. He then became a priest, a Dawson priest, and then he finally joined the Dominicans because they were the ones standing up for the rights of the Native Americans.
And he's left us a record of his encounter with the
He's a superb writer. Superb. I don't know how he did as much as he did, at the same time write as much as he did.
And I should tell viewers about this book in that you use many of these what they call primary sources. Chronicles of those who were in the activities in the 16th century, 17th century. So we feel really as if we're on the spot with these people. Yes. You develop a real understanding of the environment and the activities, and you show a lot of very interesting characters.
Yes, well, I'm working, first of all, you have to have those documents. They're there. For instance, when Acoma was massacred, there was a hearing back in Mexico City saying, why did this happen? Well, you have the documents, the testimony. And in the case of New France, Samuel de Champlain was an extraordinary writer. The Jesuit Relations, go to over 70 volumes of reports, the Jesuit missionaries. So you have a wealth of information. And I try and move towards interaction of biography of people, individuals, the landscape, and the Catholic tradition then coming to pull all these things together into a new way of being an American.
Very interesting.
And possibly also a new way of being an American Catholic.
We'll come back after this break and talk more with Professor Kevin Starr about his book, Continental Ambitions. Hello, we're back with Professor Kevin Starr talking about Catholic history in America. Now, Kevin, the New World had new peoples, a wide array of cultures, and these three distinct Catholic perspectives, the Spanish, the French, and the English, met with them. Can you compare how the three different sorties into this country dealt with the native people, and also how the native people dealt with them? Maybe I can pose it this way. If you were a native of America watching an approaching band of Europeans, which would you have liked or preferred to have seen coming in?
The Spaniards had the difficulty getting started. They had been in a crusade against the Muslims of Spain. They came to enrich themselves. For instance, when Columbus went back to Spain after the first voyage. He brought 200 slaves, enslaved Native Americans with him. Queen Isabella said, "You bring them back. I sent you out there to evangelize these people, not to enslave them." So Spain had to come to a realization that it was not behaving correctly and that it must reform itself. And that took 30 to 40 to 50 years to get going. In the case of the French had an instinctive ability to deal diplomatically with Native Americans. And in fact, the first tribes encountered along the maritime provinces to this day are Catholic. The Micmacs, for instance, or the St. John's. And in the case of the Hurons, you had a whole conversion of a whole people, the Hurons, who were...
The Huron nation, remind me, New York State?
New York and Canada, the Canadian border, both sides of the border. And they were, of course, devastated in 1649 by the Iroquois. Iroquois invasion came in, and you had the North American martyrs, all those Jesuit missionaries, brothers, Donnés, who were executed. So I would say the Spanish had to learn it. The French understood it better. The Spaniards also had trouble having women come over, Spanish women to come over, Spanish women to come over, and over time, through Christian marriage, through Catholic marriage, a new race is born, a mixed race. Say, for instance, in New Mexico, by the time of the 1830s and 40s, you have 60,000 people who are the laity. They are, and I look at the Santoses, their religious art, as a way of looking into that Catholicism of theirs, which blended Hispanic and indigenous forms.
This is of interest because these expeditions are principally males, these
Yes.
French, Spanish, and English, but some may include females. But I believe there's difficulty getting women and wives into the colonies or the expedition.
Yes.
So how was that solved?
Well, it's solved by the time we developed the Mexican people. In the 18th century, De Anza, for instance, the Colonel De Anza is capable of bringing them up from Tucson into California for settlement in the mid-1770s. In the case of France, there was initially an idea that we could educate the Native Americans and have a mixed race to develop. And then later, Louis XIV and his minister Colbert also set up a program, Daughters of the King, in which young women from farms who were second, third daughters, without dowries, who otherwise would have had to have a Cinderella life working for their older sister, could then go out to Canada and marry. And within 100 years, you have the creation of the great French-Canadian people. In the case of the Catholics going into Maryland, they tended to come men, women, and children, and that's the more common English pattern of immigration.
And I'm not aware if there was a high rate of intermarriage with various native peoples early on, or if there wasn't, or was it different for...
There was a high rate in terms of the further you got out into the frontier in French Canada, the more you had mixed populations grow. You also had a mixed population growth in the maritime provinces because you had this Catholic Native American population. In the case of the case of New Spain, that took about 100 years for a fully new people to appear on the planet. And in the case of Maryland, they were Anglo-Americans from the beginning, men, women, and children.
The Jesuits are a leading character in your book, and I wanted to ask you in detail about them. They may be the most important characters in your book.
Well, I think for New France, the Jesuits are very important, along with the Sulpicians and the Capuchin Franciscans and the Recollect Franciscans. But the Jesuits were the ones to take Christianity into Huronia very courageously, then later on to the Great Lakes, then down the Mississippi Valley to New Orleans itself. You also have diocesan clergy, Sulpician diocesan clergy teaching in seminaries, and you have the Parish Foreign Mission Society. In the case of New Spain, it's almost exclusively a Franciscan missionary effort. From Florida to Texas to New Mexico to Arizona, which of course Arizona was an exception. They come up from Mexico. Father Kino, Eusebio Kino, found Xavier del Bac in 1700, and the Jesuits are in Baja. Once the Jesuits are suppressed, Baja is turned over to the Franciscans and Dominicans, and of course the Franciscans take over California.
And the Jesuits play a major role in the English Catholic settlement on the eastern seaboard, do they not?
Absolutely. At the time of American independence, 24, 25 priests in North America, in the what then becomes the United States. Each one is an ex-Jesuit. Now, why ex-Jesuit? Because the society was suppressed in 1773.
And the Society of Jesus was suppressed by
suppressed by Pope Clement, and it was suppressed. Basically, the muscle behind that were the Bourbons. The ruling families of France, Spain, and Portugal felt that the Jesuits had become too powerful, too rich, a church within a church, and threatened their own continental ambitions, the way they wanted to be running their territories. I don't know if you saw the movie The Mission a number of years ago. It was a great film where the Jesuits organized the Native Americans to defend themselves.
Yes. You give a detailed picture of the Jesuits protecting Indians, I think, from some exploitation.
Yes.
And we may talk about it in the next segment. We'll take a break now and come back soon to talk with Professor Kevin Starr. Hello and welcome back to Mosaic. We'll turn to a more local angle. Professor Starr is a Californian. We're Californians. And I'd like to ask you about this. Can I say you're the leading expert on California history?
Well, it's not a crowded field, but you could say that.
All right, but several books on this. So you spend a good deal of time in the book describing in detail how the Spanish came up from the south to go into California.
Yes.
And also occasionally the English were sailing up the coast looking for a harbor. The Russians were pushing down. So in that long history, what were the Spanish ambitions and how did California come to be?
Well, I think there was a remarkable partnership between Father Serra and Fray Bucarelli. Fray Bucarelli was a Knight of Malta, professed religious. He was the Viceroy of New Spain. And Bucarelli Bay in Alaska is named after his honor. He sponsors this exploration of the coast, which eventually in 1790, a competition develops, as you suggest, between the English, the Russians, and Americans for anchorage, literally, in Alaska. And I also realized how late California was. If you have efforts to settle Florida as early as 1520s, and we wait to California for the Franciscans to come to 1769, why this long delay?
Yes.
And I work with that in the book. And I suggest also the fact that California was the first of these colonies to attain its own bishop in what is the present-day United States. Bishop Diego Moreno is established here in the early 1840s. Now, he's not necessarily received that well by a lot of the Californios because they know that he's going to insist on justice for the Native Americans, and there'd be some conflict there.
I see. And the discovery of San Francisco Bay, where we live, was more or less accidental. Am I right about that?
Yes. Well, the point was that they thought Monterey Bay was going to be the big bay because that was described as having more capacity than it really did. And so when Portola, in 1769, coming up on those hills in Pacifica, and looks out and sees that bay and sends then Sergeant Ortega and some men around to explore that. It's a moment of power, like the Greek Enophons, when the Greeks see the sea and say, Thalassa, Thalassa, Thalassa.
Yes.
And I have a beautiful painting in the book by Arthur Matthews, the great San Francisco-based painter, showing that, which was lent to me by the widow of a good friend of mine who owned that painting.
And I believe, as you remind us in your book, I think this is correct, that all these people wanted to get to California, not just for California itself, but because it's the gateway to the east.
The Spaniards were obsessed by the Pacific. In fact, when they first went into New Mexico, and when Ugarte went into New Mexico, he had rights to have ports on the Pacific, as if the Pacific was going to come down into northern New Mexico. They believed that there might be a river that would flow westward into the sea, the San Bonaventura. They even gave it a name, Santa Bonaventura. They wanted that Pacific connection because from the 1560s onward, from Mexico, they were in contact with the Philippines.
Yes, right.
The first voyage. Can you imagine the heroic nature of that sailing and that connection? And the one Manila galleon that would come each year across the Japanese current and make landfall in California and then sail down to Mexico.
Right.
So
Manila
they had a sense of the unity of the Asia-Pacific basin way ahead of anyone else.
Pretty amazing. It's an amazing story. Now, let me ask you this. I can assure all the viewers that the book is wonderful to read. It has 16 or 18 gorgeous colored plates. It has maps. It's a pleasure. There's not a bad sentence in it.
Thank you.
But what I want to ask you is, who is your audience for this book? What do you hope it can accomplish? And is this the only book? I think you said it's the first portion of a grand narrative.
Yes. Well, we'll take up the audience first. I wrote this book for my fellow Catholics. And that's why I was just thrilled to have the book with Ignatius Press, because they're a leading Catholic
local Catholic publisher in San Francisco.
In San Francisco. My other books I did with Oxford University Press, Random House, other publishers, they were aimed towards a different audience. I want my fellow Catholics, and there's 74, 75 million of us, to have a sense that we were not just an immigrant church. We were not just Johnny-come-latelys to the American experience. Indeed, we have played a foundational role in the Euro-American encounter. So that's number one. And secondly, as you know, I give myself narrative. I tell stories that how people encounter things, because I'm looking at that interaction of the person, the event, and the Catholic implication. So I got up to 1774. I end with John Carroll coming back from Europe after 20 years.
And John Carroll would be the first bishop.
He's consecrated in 1790. He was a prefect apostolic before that. And I'm on the second volume now. I'm halfway through, and it deals with the Revolutionary War and the early Republic.
How many volumes do you project in the series?
Well, I always say that at my age, I don't buy a green banana, but maybe I'm sort of trying to deal with God, saying, if you keep me on this planet, I'll keep producing these books.
Thank you. Professor Starr, thank you so much for being here. Again, the book is Continental Ambitions. The author is Kevin Starr of San Francisco. A wonderful book. Thank you for joining us on Mosaic, and I hope you will enjoy Continental Ambitions and its successor books when they come out.